40 years ago, Ian won the Somerset Maugham Prize for First Love Laugh Rights. Almost 30 years ago, he won the Whitbread novel for The Child in Time. 20 years ago, he won the Booker Prize for Amsterdam. 10 years ago, Atonement hit the screen and has since sold 5 million copies. On Chesil Beach was shortlisted for the Booker, and today he's here. What a pleasure. I often think of his novels centre around a moment of decision, which then has a lifetime of repercussions, sometimes regret, often dread and disaster. And I'm thinking particularly of on Chesil Beach. And Ian and I were at the premiere of the film version last week, where in the semi-foggy rain, he and his wife, Annalena, in tears at the end of the movie, as a result of seeing that single incident turn into a lifetime of regret. And I wonder if those single incidents are something which sort of crystallise around your mind when you're writing the beginning of that narrative and a story.
It feels a bit shameful to be somewhat tearful at your own screenplay, and I'm horrified that you noticed. Yes, in the case of On Chesil Beach, the moment is when a young man, being married for 5 or 6 hours, gets in a row with his young, equally innocent wife, and doesn't turn to forgive her. And when she says, let's go back to the hotel together, he just stands staring out to sea, won't speak to her. And the rest of his life really is determined by that one moment of silence. So it's not a violent moment. But in all those sort of set pieces that you refer to, I refer back to a famous preface by Joseph Conrad. It was a preface to The Nigger of the Narcissus, and it's a rather manifesto-like statement in which he talks about his overriding ambition towards the reader. And he says, what I wish to do is to make you feel and to make you hear, but above all, to make you see. And to make you see, and I know exactly what he meant in terms of prose writing. And I've always felt that the key to a fast-moving or significant, weighty scene is to get the visual details right. And it doesn't mean packing it Balzac style with masses of description, but key visual details are like little points of light. And if you can just get the right number and the right balance of that and have the reader see the orientation of the characters or where they are, where the room is, how it's working visually on the page, the emotional content will follow.
So it's Nabokov fondled details.
Yes, I mean, Nabokov was referring to what readers should do. He was talking to first-year students at Cornell in 1953, and it was a wonderful remark. Forget the moonshine of generalization and themes, he said. Very good advice. But these points of light, I think, they're not so much fondleable as should be illuminating. And if you can simply get those mapped out, even before you're on the page, it's immensely helpful to the reader to get the emotional thrust of whatever it is you're trying to achieve.
So with On Chesil Beach, if we just stick with that example for the time,
yep.
Were there particular details which did start the book? Was it the dreadful bedroom scene where nothing happens?
This moment that we're talking about towards the end of the novel, I had no idea about when I started.
Really?
No, I mean, you come across it and it's an opportunity. I mean, I knew it would end in tears. Not mine, by the way.
Your wife's in the cinema.
Yeah. That was 7 years ahead. I knew this. I was writing. In fact, I had to do a bit of research on. Surely someone else has written this novel, an innocent couple, reasonably well educated, 22 years old. All the wedding, the confetti, the cake is all over, and they've driven to a little seaside hotel. Now, finally, and to them, there's some terror in this, they are alone. And there's a vast, creaking four-poster bed, and they're going to have to get on it. And as the boy thinks to himself that for however briefly, one portion of himself was going to have to reside inside this formidably intelligent and beautiful woman. How this was to be achieved, he had no idea. No idea at all. And it doesn't go well, and the marriage breaks after 6 hours, and they go their separate ways. The movie goes off in a slightly different direction. There was an opportunity there for me to have him see her one last time at the end of his life while she's playing a Mozart D major quintet. She's a string quartet player. It seems to me, a perfect encapsulated story for a novella. The first few hours of a marriage that doesn't quite work out. And I asked around and couldn't get an answer. Someone said, that's a famous Chekhov story. Surely you've read it. Because I dreaded, I spent 18 months, 2 years writing this, and then someone tell me that Martin Amis had done it. Actually, I'd know if he'd done it. I read it all. But it seemed like an opportunity. But quite what would happen all along the way and how I'd get to that end point, that's the bit that one almost doesn't want to think about, because part of the pleasures of composition is the element of surprise.
But the awkwardness of their inability to find a way beyond the 6 hour of marriage, was that in place at the beginning?
Yeah. It's stated almost in a kind of rather old-fashioned 19th century way. It's a long lens, as it were, on them. They were young, educated, and entirely sexually innocent on this their wedding day, and then move in closer to a supper that they don't really want, and a forced conversation. The point is, this is 1962. The 60s has not begun and won't begin for another 3 or 4 years. The 60s for me didn't really begin until about 1971. What we refer to by the 60s is very elastic.
And albeit there is not a lot of sex in this novel, Martin Amis, I think, said to you, don't write about sex. Is sex difficult to write about? Because you've done it in Atonement, you've done it in...
It's hard to avoid in a way, because if human relations are your central concern, and that really is the central concern of the novel, generally, human condition and relations, sooner or later you're going to have to do it. And I think there are 1,000 ways of half avoiding it. In movies, you jump cut to a post-coital cigarette. Those old black and white, room at the top style. The couple are lying on their backs, and it's been brilliant, because they need a cigarette. And that's it. It's harder to do it now because smoking in the bedroom not permitted. But now and then, I think, talking about explosions and trains going into tunnels and things, you can't do all that, really. What you can do is the emotional element of it, which seems to me it's very hard to convey the sensory, the qualia, as it were, of the supreme experience of being an adult and being in love and having successful sexual relations with someone. Surely that is one of the peaks of adult life. So, in a sense, it has to be addressed.
Yeah, and it's been a theme you've touched on, or a topic from your early, more sort of gothic short stories, through to in Sweet Tooth, where there's a tremendous love affair, which then sours for different reasons. But the broad range which you've dealt with sex, going from incest to perfect marital love, How difficult is it to do the bad and the good of it?
Well, the novel is always interested in things going wrong. I mean, generally, and Iris Murdoch famously talked about happiness writing white. That's especially true, I think, of sex. I mean, you can't have your characters page after page having fabulous sex. I mean, maybe in a pornographic novel, but even then that would dull, wouldn't it?
Well, even in Sweet Tooth, they begin having rather desultory sex, and then it goes on to being rather good.
Well, the outside world also penetrates, if I can use that word, and then that's interesting. When contemporary morality, or in the case of Sweet Tooth, lying and spying and mutual surveillance is also an element. The sexual act can become like the centre of a web in which 1,000 other contingencies press in on all sides, and that's interesting from that point of view. I still think that the key element is the emotional things. How do we describe a sensory experience? I mean, you do it in metaphors, that's hardly satisfactory, and the ground is so trampled upon. John Updike, I think, is one of the most brilliant describers of sexual encounters, does it all visually. I mean, it is all amazing descriptions of couples, which many people think is one of his lesser novels. I think it's a marvellous novel. Has extraordinary descriptions. I mean, clinical beyond the clinic.
But I think probably you've got the most unusual view ever expressed in a novel about sex, which is in a nutshell, which is from the view of an embryo experiencing the mother having sex from the inside.
Yes, having a point of view is crucial to this. Yes, I mean, the fetus there worries that his uncle's penis is going to shaft his very soft skull
slightly along,
erupt and fill his brain with his semen, and then he'll become his uncle's son.
Absolutely,
and become as stupid as his uncle.
Yeah.
I would have thought that'd be the least of his worries, actually, having your brain messed up like that. But that was sheer fun. I mean, it was just ridiculous.
I mean, this is for those who haven't read it, it's a sort of the most original view of Hamlet one's ever going to come across.
Well, Hamlet itself is pretty good. Let's not forget. Anyway, it's nice of you to say so. Can I quote you on that, please?
Often, music is either a recurring obsession of the characters. I'm thinking in the Children Act. I'm actually also thinking with on Chesil Beach, where we go from the classical music concert, which is the moment of realization when the love affair was shown to have what could have been and never was, to the 70s where with Chuck Berry, where which is a sort of metaphor for the explosion of the lack of innocence from the 60s into the real 60s and the 70s. I remember suddenly coming across you at the Wigmore Hall there was a service, I mean, a sort of informal service arranged for Muriel Spark, a series of concerts. But clearly, music is and you play.
Yeah.
You play.
I used to play the flute really badly, which you can get away with if there are 80 other instruments around you.
You still play?
No, I gave up in the end. I drove myself nuts. I could never get my tone all that good.
But your son plays anyway.
I think all of us have sort of dipped in and then dipped out. But music is important. I was just at Wigmore Hall the other day, listened to the Endelian Quartet play Beethoven's 127th String Quartet, Opus 127. In Chesil Beach, the music is very important for me because it's part of their mutual incomprehension.
Yeah.
He loves rock and roll, passion for Chuck Berry. She is the first violinist in a string quartet. She leads that quartet. She can't understand in his music, why the simplest of melodies in the simplest of common times, 4/4, would need a drummer. And she says to him, it'd be like having a drummer in a string quartet. I mean, why can't you keep time without a drummer? And she also refers to Chuck Berry as being bouncy and merry. And he says, you must be the squarest person in all of civilization. They don't understand each other's music. When Florence takes Edward on a tour of Wigmore Hall, in fact, and shows him the green room at the back of the stage, and very excitedly tells him how it was her job as a music student, it's a part-time job, to be the one who stands looking through the grille to open the door smoothly as the performers came off the stage. And she once made a cup of tea for Benjamin Britten in the interval. And at the name of Benjamin Britten, this nicely done by Billy Howell, he says, "Oh, the well-known trombonist." And it was just a way of trying to measure the difference in their world and how their love might or might not breach it.
Because you write incredibly authoritatively about music, and I just wondered if the tone and structure of musical pieces is something you try and achieve with a novel.
I think I have a sort of envy of composers. I once tried to write in Amsterdam what it would be like to compose a symphony, and whether it was all just sort of dreams, abstract dreams of reaching through some clever modulation into another remote key, whether you'd see it as sort of floating steps or climbing up a waterfall, or is it hard-edged kind of calculation about harmonics? And I honestly don't know. I think what writers envy in composers is that they are set free into total abstraction. I mean, when somebody says, this is a gorgeous, slow movement, elegiac, and someone else says it's tragic, someone else... I mean, it's very hard to pin down meaning.
But in Amsterdam, you also capture the nightmare of composure with the open-ended borders and trying to pin down a structure which might seem rather ethereal.
I mean, I don't think we can ever get that structure into the written word. The written word refers outwards always specifically to the world. When you're sitting in the Wigmore Hall and there's a Beethoven string quartet or let's say we're still in the 19th century or 18th century, and you hear a first theme, then you hear a wonderful piece of modulation, second theme, then back to the first theme for its exposition, then the second theme's exposition. I mean, the sonata form is a wonderful piece of structure. It's very hard, and lots of writers have tried to do sonata form into literature. But the trouble is the reader doesn't notice, because the reader is in a perpetual present of reference. So I look on music with a kind of a longing and envy and awe. I still don't really understand how a symphony gets written or a sonata gets written. I don't know where you would even begin.
You're not called an experimental writer, and is that possibly because the experiments you take work so well? Because the different forms and structures and subject matters and explorations have been, there's almost a predictability is almost impossible with what the next McEwan novel will be. Do you feel that you're experimental?
I think I'm maybe experimental with the subject matter. With the prose itself, I've always longed to be understood, and the great problem with the experimental novel, and the great monument, of course, is Finnegan's Wake, is the problem of immediate access and understanding.
Have you read it?
Going on. No. I mean, I've dipped into it, yeah.
And Ulysses?
Oh, yeah, Ulysses. Yeah. I can read. No, Ulysses is relatively easy. Finnegan's Wake
is impossible.
I know all those. I mean, those famous passages and so on. But no, I think just a handful of academics.
Yeah. When you look at when you're reading the great canon, looking backwards, the historical canon of literature, is it like Lucian Freud used to go to the National Gallery and had a free pass, and we used to go and see the great painters?
Yeah.
But actually, he used to go and see them not purely for inspiration. He used to see them as competition. Do you?
I haven't got to that stage.
You haven't got to that stage yet.
I never will.
Are you quite disparaging about some of the great names? You think actually, when you reread them, they're not as good as? How harsh are you when you read?
No, I don't feel harsh. What was my last encounter? Oh yeah, on the plane yesterday. I've got an app which Annalena, my wife, gave me on my phone, and it's a poetry app.
Yeah.
And it just will disgorge, if you're bored by the luggage carousel, give you a poem. And it was Shelley's poem on intellectual beauty, which I don't think I'd read. I'd forgotten it existed. I hadn't read it since I was at school. And it was amazing. I was just lost for 5-7 minutes inside this poem. No, I would regard it as a resource. And if ever you feel flat, and a horrible creeping negative sense of not seeing the point at all of more literature, which can creep up on you, then, as I did the other week, I read the 3rd chapter of Saul Bellows' Herzog. Yeah. I just thought it was magnificent. Sometimes it is like dipping. So the 6th chapter of Dombey and Son, which is about digging the railway out of Euston, and wrecking Camden Town.
Very, very topical.
Yeah. Yes, we're about to do it again. It was done rather even more harshly when Dickens was looking back at a time when people were just turfed out of their houses so that the navvies could start building this colossal valley out of North London. That's beautifully done too. And
inspiring or daunting?
No, inspiring. It just reminds you what can be achieved. It's thrilling. And right at the beginning of my writing career, when I was a student doing literature at university, I came to understand of literature as a sort of an amazing conversation. And the great thing about this conversation is that you can join it. And you might not get heard, and your first voice is going to be very piping, and you'll be standing on tiptoe to be noticed. But it is a conversation. It's a democratic conversation. It does not require a lot of materials, unlike movie making, to write a poem or a novel. It needs a bit of time, maybe. That's all.
And yet your entry into the world of literature, when you were applying to Cambridge, there was that moment when these rather snobbish, intimidating dons talking about Shakespeare and made you confess you hadn't
read Macbeth.
Which precluded you from going there.
Well, it was a little more complicated than that. They were quite right to turn me down. I could talk easily on about 15 Shakespeare plays. I mean, I really was fairly well up. But, there are 37. I knew the plot of Macbeth, but I was trying to make a kind of general point about Shakespeare's tragedies. And one of them chipped in and said, but what about Macbeth? And I made a perfectly coherent answer. But then 3 minutes later, there were 3 of them facing me. Another one said, can we just go back to Macbeth? And I thought, oh my God, no, please. And they asked a slightly more kind of penetrating question, which I fumbled with. And then the 3rd one said, Mr. McEwan, have you read Macbeth? And I said, no, I haven't. And I was so ashamed that the rest of the interview I refused to speak. I didn't speak a word. And then I had to go and see the personal tutor, moral tutor, whatever. And he said, well, Mr. McEwan, what have you been reading lately? I've been reading masses lately.
Yeah.
I said, I'm not speaking. And he said so kindly, he said, I tell you what, I've got this essay to mark. It'll take me 10 minutes, finish marking this essay. Then I'll ask you the same question again. So you just think about it. So 10 minutes went by, and I was still numb from this humiliation. So he said, so, Mr. McEwan, what have you been reading lately? And I said, I'm not speaking. And it ended. I walked away from King's College and thought, I think I have to go somewhere else.
It's like a McEwan novella, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it's Chesil Beach in sort of. Yeah.
But actually, was it a good thing? Because you ended up going to Sussex, where
I might have. See, I'd been at a state boarding grammar school, which actually I rather liked by the end. And I think if I'd sunk into King's College, I might have been just sunk there for the rest of my life. It looked just perfect for an enclosed life, a bit like being in prison. You hear of these prisoners who come out and they really just want to go back because life's so chaotic and unpredictable. And I think I might have turned out like that.
But that hunger for reading, that hunger for understanding books, from that very early days, did you think you were going to be engaged on a life of writing? Because your dad had gone through the ranks, become a mage. Your mum had worked for M&S and been a
chambermaid.
Chambermaid. Yeah. So there wasn't a literary pulse coming through the family.
There was a great respect for education.
Yeah.
I mean, they both left school at 14, so they wanted me to have lots of what they didn't have. So I'm always grateful for that. Round about my second year at university, I had some wonderful teachers there at Sussex, which still ran itself on a tutorial system. And one of them was Lawrence Lerner.
Oh, yes.
And we had a thrilling intellectual time together. And it was about that time he urged me to read Kafka and Bruno Schulz. And those two together, they seemed so startlingly different from anything else I'd read. And it was round about then that I started writing.
But was it like in the novel Stoner, where the sort of sense of literature was a pathway out of an existence which you didn't want to stay in?
Well, I'd always thought, because I'm one of those writers with a marvellous English teacher. In fact, I'm going to see him for lunch tomorrow. I mean, he was teaching me in 1964, and we'll be having a pint of beer tomorrow. Yes, I arrived sort of just with a kind of Leavisite passion and a belief that literature was a sort of priesthood and that it was my duty to get a good degree and then go and teach literature in university. That was how I saw it. But by that all collapsed after a year and a half. I wanted to write.
Or did you not want to teach?
No. So I saw writing also as a way out of ever getting a job. And it seemed to me a beckoning freedom. If I could live by writing, it would be the perfect existence.
But having taken that decision, and I think they were experimental, your first short stories, they were also quite high risk because they dealt with very dangerous subjects of dark sexuality, incest.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know where it all came from, Geordie. I think I've been a sort of rather well-behaved teenager. Therefore, something was boiling away inside me that had not yet kind of... I hadn't done much wrong as a teenager. I hadn't transgressed in the proper conventional way.
Hadn't run through a wheat field.
No, I hadn't run through a wheat field, clothed or not. No, not even a wheat field. So my early short stories were my wheat field.
And did they seem dangerous? When you handed them in to the publisher, or did they just...
I think I was when I say an innocent, I had read The Naked Lunch of Burroughs and read all of Ulysses and Lawrence.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that those freedoms were won long ago. I mean, the Lady Chatterley trial happened when I was about 12 or 13. I was very aware of it. I thought that was all behind us, that literature could treat any subject it wanted. So I was rather innocently surprised when the stories were bound together in a volume and then were discussed in the public prints. Up until that time, I'd pass them around friends and nobody. Yeah. Or when I was at UEA as an MA student doing literature, gave them to Malcolm Bradbury or Angus Wilson. No one had said, "Whoa, this is going to get you into some hot water." Everyone just took it for granted. So it was a strange moment.
Well, as ever, the treatment overtook the subject, and that's what made them so extraordinary.
Yeah, well...
Were they difficult to chisel? Did it come easily? Were they... those early...
Writing never came easily to me back then. I wrote very, very slowly, always suspicious that I was not quite getting what I meant down, so it was really sentence by sentence. But not because of the subject matter.
No.
More just the voice, the prose. That was.
Well, I remember we've talked on another occasion when you talked about how your father came up through the ranks and your mother, and then became a major. So he wasn't immediately officer class.
Yeah.
And it was so class ridden then.
Yeah.
And your mother, from a working class background, this dual way of communicating with officers like your father, and then sort of born to be officers who were probably rather patronising and snobbish, and so that use of language and choice was a tightrope of either working or not working with the communication.
I once wrote a little essay about this called Mother Tongue. My mother's language was curious, and you go for the extraordinary business in the British Army. If you come up through the ranks and then you get commissioned as an officer, you're then posted. And so you move from the world of the sergeant's mess to the officer's mess. In the new officer's mess, there will be majors and lieutenant colonels who are young men who've gone through Sandhurst. And then there's a somewhat more grizzled set of men who have spent 30 years getting to this point. And it's a complete class division. So all my father's friends were men like him, come up through the ranks. For my mother, it was very painful to have to go to the officers' mess for dinner and sit next to the colonel's wife. And I observed it even as a child. She would put on this voice and throwing H's in front of words that didn't need them. And she did feel like language was some kind of bomb that was going to go off in her face.
Were you mortified by this? Or were
No, I was too young to be mortified by it. But at some point, I was aware of it in myself. Yeah. And I remember I used to have my mother's habit of saying done for did. So if I wanted a simple past of to do, so quite a common form of diction, I was certainly aware of it in myself. And we used to have a history lesson round a table at school. And I said to my best friend, look, if ever I say done for did, just point it out to me, because I've got to get rid of this habit. It's driving me nuts. So I was delivering a set piece to the class on the extirpation of simony in the papacy of Innocent III.
I remember, yeah.
Okay. I love saying the extirpation of simony. Anyway, I said, I must have said a done. And my friend Mark said, did. And the history teacher said, get out of my class. I will not have this snobbery. And I had to leap to my feet and say, no, sorry, I asked him to say that. And he said, all right, okay, sit down. He was called Charles Watts, the wonderful history teacher. We called him Charlie Watts. He wasn't called Charlie Watts, actually. He was called Mr. Watts. His name was Henry, but we called him Charlie Watts because he didn't look at all like the drummer of the Rolling Stones.
What class do you feel today, having seen, and do you think class is relevant today?
Oh, it's definitely relevant, but so rather like my father, I guess I've sort of come up through the ranks. I feel, what do they say, orthogonal to it.
I was thinking he was completely classless. Actually.
Yeah, well, it's very hard to be classless in England, but there's my origins, and then the strange transitions my parents made, and then my own transitions through a world of literary world. It hasn't gone away. I mean, in the culture at large, and actually, when we were last with armed forces, sort of Afghanistan, say Helmand Province, and there'd be a TV interview with a corporal, and then one with his platoon commander, who'd be a young lieutenant.
Captain, yeah,
and you see the accents, which was exactly still, working class corporal, middle class, upper middle class, public school, Sandhurst.
Yeah.
It seems extraordinary to me, but it's still very much in place.
And did the journey your parents made and the journey you've made, you're on the left of the centre of politics. You've said you voted Lib Dem on the whole, or occasionally Green.
Occasionally Green.
Yeah. Is that still and you've got involved in politics on occasional levels with
I've never been an activist. I've never joined a political party. I was.
Brexit was something which.
But Brexit depresses me or enrages me. Sure.
Do you still think there's going to be a second referendum?
There's a number that's got etched into my thoughts lately. 07212. It's the number of the briefing paper issued on the 3rd of June 2015, which was made available to all MPs, informing them that the referendum of 2016 was going to be advisory. Now, the Minister for Europe, Mr. Liddington, as he then was, told the House in very specific, emphatic terms, in answer to a couple of questions, that the reason we did not need a supermajority for this referendum, even though it had huge constitutional implications, was because it was merely advisory on Parliament. And I think we've forgotten the fake origins of this terrible crisis we're in. And I have to say, my own feelings about it are that the whole political class has let us down. All of them, with some honourable exceptions. Kenneth Clarke, Dominic Grieve, Nick Clegg, certain members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, but on the whole, as a class, they never demanded to discuss the result of the referendum. The referendum was never discussed in Parliament. And it was an extraordinary thing.
I mean, as you know, I led a
pro
Remain paper in a world which is on the media was predominantly Brexit, and you wrote a piece for me before. Can you just take us through on the morning of waking up? Did you have a sense of grief for something lost for our country? What was your feeling?
Like lots of people, sort of disbelief at first, because I, just like everyone else, I just probably fatally, like David Cameron, thought this is just something you have to go through to satisfy the.
What was the loss here? What would have been lost?
Well, I mean, we can talk about all the trade and the trade arrangements, all the trading bloc. Find it's fantastic opportunities globally that we already have that we're now seeking all over again. But I think it was a sort of sense of a communality and a polity, and a sense too that rarely in history, for all its faults, rarely in history could you get nations that were once at war to bond in such a way. And it seemed to me one of the most extraordinary political arrangements in human history. It had, of course, democratic deficits, a bureaucracy that's sometimes fumbling and too large. But still, it seemed to me, in that initial impulse to bind France and Germany together, it had succeeded. And it's very likely now it's going to fall into two speeds, because the Eurozone was going to have to bind itself together to get a proper fiscal entity. And we could be quite comfortable, I think, in the slower track of it. And I guess the Brexiters fear most a 2-year adjustment period, because we might then just lose the will and end up in that second track and the whole thing dissolve. I hope that's what happens. But what a mess now.
Did your deep feeling for that, does that translate down the line into something creative, fiction-wise for you? Or is it that's just a separate box?
I think these things take time for novelists. If you rush into it as a novelist...
it's too obvious.
Yes. And how to do it. I mean, how to do it.
It's who, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean...
Because if you've gone from neurosurgeons to desultory, disastrous honeymoon couples to Nobel physicists to family court judges who have a link and liaison with an 18-year-old.
Yeah. I think it would take me 3 or 4 years to digest it into a fictional state. It's perfect for long-form journalism and reportage, but I don't see yet how to... Also, the story is extraordinary. I mean, at least, gosh, does one need a newspaper these days?
Yes.
We're only third of the way through this narrative. I mean, where is it heading? I mean, one novelistic detail I would cherish is that both the leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the Tories both demurred when asked how they would vote if they were having another vote in a referendum, and both, in a rather biblical way, or like jesting Pilate. I mean, they did not stay to give an answer. So I think we're in an extraordinary cloud of uncertainty here. So that's another reason not to even think of writing a novel about Brexit.
Yeah. Are you in the middle of a novel at the moment? Or can you tell us a little about it? Or?
No.
Even a hint?
Hint. It's a science fiction novel set in the past. How about that? Or, roughly that.
There's a figure, or there's a... I'm not going to press you more than that.
It's a figure of a man. It sounds like Revelation. And his number is 27,000 words. Is where I am
right
now. But I've been very involved with these screenplays, and that's very easy to talk about because 2 of the movies are made, and I'm just writing Sweet Tooth. I'm just handing in the second draft of that.
And is that an exciting process, or is that going back and kind of warming up what you've already cooked?
It's something I've been doing since 1974. As for warming up something I've already cooked, it was a very nice way of putting it. Thank you. Actually...
is the discipline so different, is it?
The discipline's so entirely different. The negotiations with others, the collaborations are sometimes vexing, but a lot of the time I've been very lucky in the people I've worked with. But on the whole, it's been exciting. But it's also a chance to go back and find other ways of doing things.
I often think with a novelist, which is a very solitary activity, and the film world is a very collaborative.
Yeah.
Well, is that part of the attraction for you?
Yeah, there's that and all the expertise of a film set. There's a fantastic concentration of other people's, carpenters and focus pullers and electricians and sound and costumes.
Also extending the story. I mean, again on Chesil Beach, there's the final scene is completely revelatory.
The chance to do something that in a novel might just be in summary. Suddenly needs to be opened up, and so, for example, in the novel On Chesil Beach, there's a sort of 8-page summary of the next 45 years, which I had to find a film version for. And so I got very involved in writing a scene in which the young man, now it's 12 years have gone by since he walked away from his marriage. He runs a rather ropey, run-down little record shop near Camden Lock, which is still very seedy in those days and not much visited. And in comes a little girl carrying a violin case to buy, and asks to buy a record by Chuck Berry. And he gets one for her, the best of, and then he says, "You don't seem the right age to be playing or be interested in this." He said, "No, it's for my mum. She's rather old, she's 36. She just listens to classical music, but she does like Chuck Berry. She thinks he's bouncy and merry," in which, of course, at that point he knows he's talking to the daughter he never had. Something that, if I'd thought of at the time, I probably would have put in the novel. But I had more time to play with this.
Is it a revisionist exercise in some ways?
Yeah.
Rather like Yeats would rewrite and rewrite poems.
Yes, or Auden, fatally. Yeah. A chance to seize other opportunities.
Yeah. And before I go on to the audience, I just want to ask about the sense of suspense and dread which you drive us to turn pages with a increasing alacrity and enjoyment. To incite that hunger in a reader, is that something which continually you think about in the process of writing? And when you're rereading what you've written, do you think, actually, too slow, let's take out that passage or condense?
Well, often I think I'm, in those cases, often working against my own interests, because I don't really want people to be turning pages very fast. I mean...
you want them to be driven to want to?
No, I want them to be lingering over my immaculate prose. I don't
that too.
The blur of page turning going on, just to find out what happened. So, well, I always come back to...
So it's a brake and an accelerator you're trying to do?
There was a lovely book review written by Henry James of a book by someone called Besant, and it's now fallen into almost the classical literature of the definition of what a novel should be, because along the way Henry James tosses off a number of thoughts about the form in general, right. Which are lapidary. And one of the things he says is that the first duty of the novelist, and you think, what is the first duty of the novelist? Is to be interesting. And now I know that there are readers of the last three novels of Henry James who thinks he's ignoring his own advice. I'm quite a fan of The Golden Bowl and The Ambassadors. But anyway, it's something so obvious that it's easy to dismiss. But it is extraordinary the number of novels you pick up, and the first 5 pages are so uninteresting.
Yeah.
And it's as if the novelist thinks that you owe him or her a debt, whereas I think it's the other way around. Yeah. And of course it begs a massive question of what's interesting, and everyone else will find different things interesting. But there is a sort of duty to engage. I mean, and I know that there's a danger there for the literary novelist to begin to think like a pulp novelist, if we can make those distinctions. But still, I think that if you're inviting someone to spend the next 10 or 15 hours, or spread out over the next week or two, of their lives in your book, well, being interesting doesn't necessarily mean dread or suspense or whatever. I mean, there's emotional interest, there's intellectual interest. There are 1,000 ways of doing this. But I am constantly aware of the quest for curiosity in the reader, and it can be a vulgar impulse, and I know, so I'm cautious about it. But at the same time, I think I always come back to Henry's advice: try and be interesting.
And does that mean, because you think of the great balloon beginning, which is an incredible set piece, I suppose if I was writing a novel, I'd be slightly worried about how do I keep up with that incredible beginning where I'm just absolutely absorbed, and to continue that.
Yeah, I mean, structurally, maybe it was a problem. Some readers wondered whether it was a mistake to have that at the beginning rather than the end. But I was...
I don't think it was, do you?
I mean, I don't. I wouldn't change a thing with that. I mean, there's lots of things I'd change in my books, and I never will, but I wouldn't change that.
Why won't you? Because if Auden and Yates can go back, and why can't McEwan go back and make it better, if it would be better?
Well, okay. Some more advice from another novelist, Kingsley Amis, says, I'm not interested in novels that don't begin, a shot rang out. I had a specific desire to to hit the ground running, and yet I couldn't find the scene. And then a friend, we were hiking in the west of Ireland, and he told me of a story he'd seen about a ballooning accident in Bavaria, tragedy actually, of a balloon that a father and son were trying to tether with a rope, and a gust of wind took the balloon up, and they were on the ropes, and they fell off the ropes to their deaths. The great scandal was that Bavarian television filmed the whole thing and showed it on the news that night. That was the story was about whether the head of Bavarian television was going to resign, because the relatives were seeing this, the whole country. So it was a terrible, terrible thing. But what struck me about this was it was said at the time that if they had both managed to hang on, there would be enough weight to keep the balloon on the ground. But I think the boy let go of the rope, thinking that he only had 20 feet to fall. And of course, that meant that the balloon shot up even further.
And does that gestate and crystallise and go round in your mind, or do you write it down on cigarette paper, or what happens?
I wrote it down immediately. But what attracted me was that there was something about morality here, something about cooperation with others. That if everyone is good, it's quite easy to be good. And we were talking at table last night about how in a corrupt, a thoroughly corrupt society where you're paying policemen and God knows what all the time, it's rational to be corrupt. It's quite difficult to be good when no one else is.
That's the system, yeah.
Yeah. So it was that, I realised that took me right into the heart of the novel that I was halfway through. So I then, that's when I grafted it onto the beginning, which at that point was an empty space.
And at this moment, we've got just less than 10 minutes. If anyone does want to ask any questions, please put your hands up. Otherwise, yes, gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you so much for coming once again. I really appreciate you and also your work altogether. I'm sure everyone else here does as well. As the literary critic Harold Bloom phrases it, the terror of the visual. With so much attention paid nowadays going to the visual, the television, the games, television shows, instead of literature, and attention spans adapting. So, do you think that literature has to change in order to grasp this modern readership, instead of being a slow, meditative process, as it usually was before these things came along?
Yeah, I'm a little sceptical of this attention span scare, because I think attention span is probably a biological function, a neural function. I mean, how much we can hold in short-term memory is not changed by a generation of Facebook folk. So our capacity to fix our attention is, I don't think, largely a cultural matter. I think it's a biological matter. So I think that people are perfectly capable. I mean, people can concentrate on Facebook for hours on end. I mean, so and going back to what you said about Bloom, whom I admire a great deal, but I disagree with him on this. I mean, 40%, if we can stay with the neuroscience, almost 40% of our neural processing is dedicated to the visual. And literature is bound to reflect. It's our best sense. If you have a dog and you watch it smelling its way around the world, and you think, what is it like to be a dog? It's certainly not a visual experience. And of course, the famous philosophical essay of what it's like to be a bat, in which your world is sound rather than vision. We are drenched our experience in the visual. Most of our vocabulary, I mean, if you look in your thesaurus for words relating to smell, it's really quite meagre against the richness of visual. And the entirety, I think, of our poetry is drenched in it too. So I don't know. I think literature shouldn't follow this, and we shouldn't worry about our attention spans.
The novel's not dead.
It's very odd the way the novel has not died. It should have. And we were having this conversation, I remember, in the 70s. It would be a regular desk editor's matter to get people to make a symposium. You must have done it yourself, I'm sure, when it's raining all day. Why has it survived? I think largely because we don't have another artistic form that is so good at investigating the relationships between people and between people and their own flows of consciousness and changing emotional states. You look at even the most unremarkable novel, you might have a scene of dialogue in which the dialogue is interrupted by a short essay. Yes, he said, full stop. Was she really approaching this in the right way? I mean, his own thoughts then spread out in a small essay. Nothing in theatre, nothing in movies can give you that interiority. And for that reason, I think the novel has hung on against all the odds. And whether it's delivered now by e-books or some other form, I think it will survive. I mean, here we are, 10 o'clock in the morning, talking about novels. So
it's a prose movie. I mean, everyone loves movies, isn't it? I think it's just a movie of one's head, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I think of consciousness as a bright inward cinema, as it were. It is worth it when you're tired of life, just to, as long as you're sighted, just to experience the miracle of your own visual field. And I was thinking about this the other day. So you see, say, roughly 180 degrees. If I put my arms out, they go out of sight. But I can't see the boundary. So when you look through binoculars, you can see the boundary of what you can see. When you look through a microscope, it's exactly the same. There's blackness. But you can't see the blackness that surrounds vision. And I was thinking, maybe death is a bit like this. It's less than nothing.
Do you think about it?
Now, I was thinking about how to describe the experience of less than nothing, and I thought, actually, the nothingness that surrounds vision is about where or the edge of the universe. You remember as children, we used to say, well, yeah, okay, if it's finite, well, what's beyond that bit? And I think, well, maybe the metaphor, the equivalent would be what's just beyond your field of vision as my hand passes into what? It's not blackness.
I remember you've talked earlier about, one gets to a certain stage in life, one knows there are only a certain amount of summers left.
Yeah, I do it when I'm brushing my teeth in the evening. I think, how many more of these have I got? It's a number,
Yeah.
So brush your teeth, keep doing it. Because,
Well, I think we're extraordinarily lucky to have Ian here. He's one of those novelists who is completely brilliant at taking us into a myriad of different worlds. He's also endlessly open and curious. This is a man who's walked more miles rambling than any other English writer since probably Coleridge. And the world which he creates and brings in with a prose which is so textured and cared for and addictively delicious for all of us is something which we're very lucky to have in this country. And I'd just like to thank Ian McEwan very much indeed for sharing his thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Geordie.